In the remote valleys of northern Montana, where the Bitterroot Mountains cast their long shadows across forgotten homesteads, there stands a weathered stone marker that most travelers pass without notice. The inscription, carved deep into the granite and worn smooth by decades of mountain wind, reads simply, "The Hemsworth family, forever young in memory, 1952. Below these words, etched in a trembling hand, are the names Marcus, Alina, Thomas, Sarah, and little Catherine. No birth dates, no death dates. Just names suspended in time like the subjects of an old photograph left too long in the sun. This marker, erected by persons unknown and maintained by no living hand, overlooks what was once the Hemsworth homestead. The foundation stones remain, arranged in a perfect rectangle beside a creek that has run dry for 30 years. But it is not the ruins of the house that draw the occasional historian or folklorist to this desolate place. It is the collection of photographs discovered in a sealed metal box buried beneath what was once the family's front porch. The photographs, numbering exactly 13, span what appears to be a 20-year period from 1952 to 1972. They show the Hemsworth family at various stages of their lives: Christmas mornings, summer picnics, birthday celebrations, quiet moments around their kitchen table. The images themselves age as photographs do. The colors fade, the edges yellow, the emulsion cracks and separates. But the subjects within these frames remain utterly unchanged. Marcus Hemsworth, photographed at what appears to be age 35 in 1952, looks exactly 35 in every subsequent image through 1972. His wife Alina, captured in that first photograph as a woman of perhaps 32, shows not a single line of aging across 2 decades of family portraits. The children present an even more disturbing consistency. Thomas, appearing to be roughly 15 in the earliest image, maintains that exact appearance through every subsequent photograph. Sarah, who seems to be 12 in 1952, never grows beyond that age in any frame. Most unsettling of all is little Catherine, frozen at what appears to be 7 years old, her gap-toothed smile and pigtails identical in every single photograph. Whether taken in 1952 or 1972, this is the story of the Hemsworth legacy, a tale that has been carefully erased from official records, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic misdirection, and relegated to the realm of mountain folklore. It is a story that challenges our understanding of time, mortality, and the terrible price of desperate bargains made in moments of unimaginable loss. The year was 1952, and the Korean War had taken its toll on American families in ways both visible and hidden. Marcus Hemsworth had returned from the conflict, bearing wounds that went far deeper than the shrapnel scars that decorated his left shoulder. He had seen things in the frozen mountains of Korea, witnessed horrors that no amount of whiskey or prayer could wash from his memory. The official records describe him as having served with distinction in the 2nd Infantry Division, but the classified reports paint a different picture entirely. During the brutal winter of 1951, Marcus's unit had been cut off from supply lines for 6 weeks. When rescue finally arrived, they found only Marcus and 3 other soldiers alive, huddled in a cave, a system that intelligence maps insisted did not exist. The other members of his unit had simply vanished, leaving behind only their equipment and, inexplicably, their photographs. Every picture the missing soldiers had carried of their families back home showed only empty frames. The images of wives, children, and parents had somehow been erased from the photographs themselves. Marcus never spoke of what had happened in those caves, but his discharge papers note recurring nightmares about the photograph collector and an obsessive fear of having his own picture taken. The military psychiatrist who examined him before his release wrote in his confidential report, "Subject displays unusual fixation on temporal permanence. Repeatedly states that time is running out and that he must preserve what matters before it's too late. Recommend continued observation, but subject is functional and poses no immediate danger to himself or others." Upon returning to civilian life, Marcus used his military savings to purchase a remote homestead in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. The property, consisting of 160 acres of timber and grassland, came with a small house and a curious history. The previous owner, a reclusive photographer named Aldrich Crane, disappeared in 1949, leaving behind only a dark room filled with strange equipment and thousands of undeveloped photographs. The real estate agent mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Crane had been experimenting with new photographic techniques that he claimed could capture the eternal moment. Alina Hemsworth, Marcus's wife of 10 years, had initially been reluctant to leave their comfortable life in Portland, Oregon. But she had watched her husband struggle with his wartime memories, and she hoped that the isolation and beauty of the Montana mountains might help him find peace. Alina was a schoolteacher by training, a woman of practical mind and gentle disposition. She had taught third grade for 7 years before the war, and she looked forward to eventually establishing a small school in their new community. Their children represented the promise of a new beginning. Thomas, at 15, was already showing signs of his father's mechanical aptitude and his mother's quiet intelligence. Sarah, 12 years old and possessed of an insatiable curiosity about the natural world, had filled notebook after notebook with detailed drawings of plants and animals. Little Catherine, just 7, was the light of the family, a child whose laughter could lift her father's spirits even during his darkest moments. The family's first months in Montana were marked by hard work and genuine contentment. Marcus threw himself into the physical demands of homesteading, finding that the exhaustion of clearing land and building fences helped quiet the voices that whispered to him in the darkness. Alina established a small vegetable garden and began teaching the children through correspondence courses. The nearest town, Millerville, was a 6-hour ride by horse, but the family found that they needed little from the outside world. It was during their first winter that Marcus discovered Aldrich Crane's darkroom. The previous owner had constructed an elaborate photographic laboratory in the basement of the house, complete with developing tanks, enlargers, and shelves lined with chemical bottles bearing labels in languages that Marcus couldn't identify. Most intriguing of all was a large format camera, unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. The device appeared to be handmade, constructed from gleaming brass and fitted with lenses that seemed to capture and hold light in impossible ways. Among Crane's papers, Marcus found a leather-bound journal filled with meticulous notes about photographic techniques and what Crane called temporal fixation. The journal described experiments in capturing not just the appearance of subjects, but their essential temporal state, their position in the flow of time itself. Crane wrote obsessively about the possibility of creating photographs that could preserve not just a moment, but the very essence of that moment, protecting it from the ravages of time and change. The final entries in Crane's journal spoke of a breakthrough he had discovered through careful analysis of certain mineral deposits found in the mountain caves, a photographic emulsion that could create what he termed eternal images. These photographs, when properly processed with the mineral-enhanced chemicals, would not merely capture their subjects, they would bind them to the moment of capture, preserving them in a state of temporal suspension. The journal's last entry, dated November 15th, 1949, was written in a shaking hand. The process works. God help me, it works. I have photographed myself, and I feel the change beginning. Time moves around me, but not through me. I am becoming like the images I create. Fixed, permanent, eternal, but the cost, ... The cost is becoming clear. I am losing my ability to exist in the present moment. I am becoming a ghost of my own capturing. If anyone finds this journal, destroy the camera. Burn the chemicals. Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve. Marcus should have heeded Crane's warning. Any rational man would have destroyed the equipment and buried the journal. But Marcus Hemsworth was not entirely rational. The horrors he had witnessed in Korea had left him with an obsessive fear of loss, desperate need to preserve and protect the precious moments of happiness that his family represented. The possibility that he could capture these moments not just in memory, but in eternal reality, proved too tempting to resist. He began experimenting with Crane's equipment in secret, working late into the night while his family slept. The mineral deposits that Crane had written about were easily found in the cave systems that honeycombed the mountains. Marcus collected samples and began preparing the special emulsion according to Crane's detailed instructions. The process was complex and dangerous, The chemicals gave off toxic fumes that left Marcus dizzy and nauseous, but the results were extraordinary. The first photograph Marcus created using Crane's process was a simple image of a wildflower that Elena had picked during one of their family walks. When developed with the mineral-enhanced emulsion, the photograph showed not just the flower's appearance, but seemed to capture its very essence. Days passed, but the flower in the photograph remained perfectly fresh and vibrant, while the actual flower that Marcus had kept for comparison withered and died. Emboldened by this success, Marcus began photographing other objects: a piece of fruit from Elena's garden, a small animal that he had captured. In each case, the photograph seemed to preserve not just the image, but the actual temporal state of the subject. The fruit in the photograph remained ripe and perfect, while real fruit rotted. The animal in the photograph remained alive and vital, but Marcus preferred not to think about what happened to the living subjects of his experiments. The temptation to photograph his family became overwhelming. Marcus told himself that he was simply preserving memories, creating a record of their happiness that would last forever. He convinced Elena that he wanted to document their new life in Montana, to create a photographic record of their fresh start. She agreed, touched by what she interpreted as her husband's renewed interest in life and family. The first family photograph was taken on Christmas morning, 1952. Marcus posed his family around their small Christmas tree, using Crane's special camera and the mineral-enhanced emulsion. The process required his subjects to remain perfectly still for several minutes while the complex exposure was completed. Elena commented on the strange quality of the light that seemed to emanate from the camera, but Marcus assured her that this was simply a characteristic of the advanced photographic equipment. The photograph, when developed, was breathtaking. Captured not just the appearance of the family, but seemed to glow with an inner light that perfectly conveyed their joy and contentment. Marcus was so pleased with the result that he immediately began planning additional family photographs, convinced that he was creating a treasure trove of preserved memories. But over the following weeks, Marcus began to notice subtle changes in his family. They seemed somehow more fixed. Their routines became more rigid, their conversations more repetitive. Lena, who had always been spontaneous and playful, began to speak in patterns that repeated themselves with mechanical precision. Thomas, previously full of teenage energy and unpredictability, started following the same daily schedule without variation. Sarah's curiosity about the natural world transformed into an obsessive cataloging of the same plants and animals, day after day. Catherine's laughter, once so wonderfully spontaneous, began to sound exactly the same each time she found something amusing. Initially, Marcus attributed these changes to the settling routine of their new life. But as the months passed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. His family was becoming less human, more like living photographs of themselves. They maintained their personalities, their love for each other, their essential characteristics. But they were losing their capacity for change and growth. The horrifying truth became clear when Marcus realized that his family members were not aging, not even slightly. Elena's face remained exactly as it had been on Christmas morning. Thomas showed no signs of the physical changes that should have been occurring in a growing teenager. Sarah remained precisely the same size and appearance. Most disturbing of all, little Catherine had not grown even a fraction of an inch, her baby teeth unchanged despite the passage of months. Marcus consulted Crane's journal with growing desperation, searching for some explanation or reversal process. But Crane's notes were clear. The temporal fixation process was irreversible. His subjects had been bound to the moment of their capture, preserved in eternal stasis. They would remain exactly as they were in the photograph, unchanged by time. As long as the photograph itself existed, the realization of what he had done to his family filled Marcus with a guilt that bordered on madness. He had stolen their futures, their ability to grow and change and experience the full spectrum of human existence. In his desperate attempt to preserve their happiness, he had condemned them to an eternal repetition of a single moment in time. But the truly horrifying aspect of Marcus's discovery was that his family seemed unaware of their condition. They continued their daily routines, expressed love for each other, and appeared to be living normal lives. Only Marcus, who had not been in the photograph, retained his ability to perceive the passage of time and the terrible unnaturalness of their situation. Driven by guilt and a desperate hope for redemption, Marcus began researching ways to reverse the temporal fixation process. He corresponded with universities, contacted photographic experts, and even reached out to practitioners of the occult arts. But every avenue of investigation led to the same conclusion: there was no known method for undoing what had been done. As the years passed, Marcus aged while his family remained frozen in time. His hair turned gray, his face lined with worry and regret, his body bent by the weight of his terrible secret. Meanwhile, Alina continued to look exactly as she had on. Christmas morning, 1952, Thomas remained a 15-year-old boy. Sarah stayed 12, and Catherine never grew beyond 7. The isolation of their mountain homestead became both a blessing and a curse. It prevented outsiders from discovering the family's unnatural condition. But it also meant that Marcus had no one to share his burden of knowledge. He began drinking, heavily desperate to dull the pain of watching his family live their eternal repetition of preserved moments. But Marcus's guilt was not his only torment. As the years passed, he began to understand that the temporal fixation process had not simply frozen his family in time. It had bound them to the photographic emulsion itself. They existed in a state of dependency on the photograph, drawing their life force from the captured image. And as Marcus studied Crane's journal more carefully, discovered references to the feeding process, the way that temporally fixed subjects required periodic renewal of their connection to the photograph. The renewal process involved creating additional photographs using the same mineral-enhanced emulsion. Each new image strengthening the subject's connection to their frozen temporal state. Marcus realized that this was why Crane had created thousands of photographs, not as artistic experiments, but as a necessity for maintaining the existence of his temporally fixed subjects. Marcus began the grim routine of creating new family photographs every few months, using different poses and settings, but always the same family members frozen in their eternal states. Each photograph required him to use more of the mineral emulsion, which meant regular trips to the cave systems to collect the strange deposits that made the process possible. The caves themselves seemed to be changing. What had once been simple limestone formations had developed an organic quality, with walls that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The mineral deposits that Marcus needed were becoming more concentrated and more potent, but they were also becoming more dangerous to handle. The toxic fumes that the processing chemicals produced were growing stronger, and Marcus found himself suffering from increasingly severe physical symptoms after each photographic session. But the most disturbing change was in the photographs themselves. While the early images had captured his family's happiness and vitality, the later photographs began to show subtle signs of deterioration. The subjects' expressions became more mechanical, their poses more rigid. The inner light that had once made the photographs so beautiful began to dim, replaced by a cold, artificial luminescence that hurt to look at directly. Marcus began to suspect that the temporal fixation process was not preserving his family at all. It was slowly consuming them. Each new photograph seemed to drain a little more of their essential humanity, replacing it with something that was merely a simulacrum of life. They were becoming less like preserved humans and more like animated photographs, puppets dancing to the rhythm of their captured moments. By 1960, Marcus had aged into an old man, his hair white and his body frail from years of exposure to the toxic photographic chemicals. His family remained exactly as they had been in 1952. But their conversations had become entirely predictable, their emotions following scripted patterns that repeated endlessly.
Ow.
They still expressed love for Marcus, but it was the love of actors, following a well-rehearsed script, not the spontaneous affection of living family members. The isolation that had once protected the family's secret began to create new problems. Occasionally, government officials would visit the homestead, census takers, tax collectors, Forest Service personnel. Marcus developed elaborate strategies for hiding his family's condition, timing these visits to coincide with periods when his family was resting between photographic renewals. He told visitors that his family was traveling or sick, or simply unavailable. But these deceptions became increasingly difficult to maintain. Marcus's own aging made it harder to handle the physical demands of the photographic process, and his family's mechanical behavior became more obvious with each passing year. He began to fear that discovery was inevitable, and with it, the exposure of his terrible secret. The breaking point came in 1965 when a young Forest Service employee named David Carpenter arrived at the homestead to conduct a routine survey. Carpenter was thorough and persistent, and he quickly noticed the inconsistencies in Marcus's story. The survey records showed that a family of 5 had been living at the homestead for over a decade, but Marcus insisted that he lived alone. Carpenter's suspicions were aroused when he discovered evidence of recent habitation, fresh tracks in the snow, recently used cooking utensils, children's toys scattered around the property. He confronted Marcus with these inconsistencies, demanding to know where his family was. Marcus, weakened by years of chemical exposure and driven nearly mad by guilt and isolation, broke down and confessed everything. He led Carpenter to the basement darkroom and showed him the photographs. Hundreds of images of the same family, spanning 13 years, showing subjects who never aged, never changed, never grew. Marcus pulled out the leather journal and the special camera, explaining Crane's process and his own terrible application of it. He showed Carpenter the mineral deposits and the chemical formulas, the detailed records of each photographic session. Carpenter's reaction was exactly what Marcus had expected: horror, disbelief, and then a growing understanding of the implications. But what Marcus had not expected was Carpenter's practical response. Instead of fleeing or reporting the discovery to authorities, Carpenter began asking detailed questions about the process. He wanted to know how it worked, whether it could be reversed, and most importantly, whether it could be controlled. Carpenter, it turned out, had his own desperate motivations. His young wife had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and he was facing the prospect of losing her within months. The possibility of preserving her in a state of temporal fixation, even if it meant sacrificing her ability to age and change, seemed preferable to losing her entirely. Marcus tried to warn Carpenter about the true nature of the process, explaining that his family had become something less than human, trapped in an eternal repetition of captured moments. But Carpenter was beyond rational persuasion. He had seen his wife's condition deteriorate rapidly, and he was willing to accept any alternative to her death. The two men formed an unlikely partnership. Carpenter would help Marcus maintain his family's secret, and in return, Marcus would teach him the temporal fixation process. They began working together in the basement darkroom, with Carpenter learning the complex chemical procedures and Marcus sharing the knowledge he had gained from 13 years of experimentation. But the process was taking an increasingly severe toll on Marcus's health. The chemical exposure had damaged his lungs and nervous system, and he was suffering from symptoms that resembled radiation poisoning. His hands shook constantly, his vision was failing, and he was plagued by headaches that left him incapacitated for days at a time. As Marcus's condition deteriorated, he began to realize that he was running out of time. His family's temporal fixation was dependent on his ability to create new photographs regularly. But his failing health made it increasingly difficult to handle the dangerous chemicals required for the process. He was facing the prospect of being unable to maintain the photographs that kept his family in their preserved state. The implications of this realization were terrifying. Marcus had never discovered what would happen if the photographic renewal process was interrupted. Crane's journal contained only vague references to dissolution and temporal collapse. Marcus suspected that if he was unable to create new photographs, his family would not simply return to normal aging. They would likely disintegrate entirely, their existence too dependent on the captured images to survive without them. Carpenter's arrival had seemed like a solution to this problem, but it quickly became clear that training someone else in the process was more complex than Marcus had anticipated. The temporal fixation procedure required not just technical knowledge, but an intuitive understanding of the relationship between the subjects and their captured images. Carpenter was mechanically competent, but he lacked the deeper comprehension that Marcus had developed through years of experimentation. The first photograph that Carpenter created independently was a disaster. The subject, a small animal that he had captured for testing, was indeed preserved in a state of temporal fixation, but the process had gone wrong in subtle ways. The animal remained alive and unchanging, but its behavior became increasingly erratic and unnatural. It moved in repetitive patterns that seemed to follow no logical sequence. Its eyes took on a glassy, unfocused quality, and it occasionally made sounds that no living animal should be capable of producing. Marcus realized that Carpenter's technique was fundamentally flawed. The young man was approaching the process as a purely technical procedure, without understanding the deeper relationship between the photographer and the subject. The temporal fixation process required not just chemical knowledge, but an emotional and spiritual connection to the subjects being preserved. Marcus had been able to maintain his family's condition because of his deep love for them, his desperate need to preserve their happiness. Carpenter lacked this connection, and his attempts at temporal fixation were creating something that was neither truly alive nor properly preserved. The partnership between Marcus and Carpenter became increasingly strained as the older man's health continued to deteriorate. Marcus was desperate to find a way to maintain his family's condition after his death. But Carpenter's technical incompetence made this seem impossible. At the same time, Carpenter was becoming increasingly impatient with Marcus's slow teaching methods and his reluctance to share certain aspects of the process. The tension between them reached a breaking point when Carpenter discovered that Marcus had been deliberately withholding information about the most advanced aspects of the temporal fixation process. Marcus had hoped to maintain some control over the dangerous knowledge, but Carpenter interpreted this as betrayal. Young man threatened to expose Marcus's secret unless he was given complete access to all of them. Crane's research and Marcus's own experimental records. Marcus, weakened by illness and facing the imminent collapse of his family's preserved existence, was forced to comply. Gave Carpenter access to the complete journal, including the sections that he had previously kept hidden. These sections contained Crane's most disturbing discoveries about the temporal fixation process, including references to what he called the collective preservation. The possibility of creating a community of temporally fixed subjects who could maintain each other's existence through shared photographic bonds. Carpenter became obsessed with this concept. He began to envision a world where death and aging could be eliminated entirely, where human beings could be preserved in states of perfect temporal fixation. He started making plans to expand the process beyond Marcus's family, to create a network of preserved subjects who could support each other's existence indefinitely. Marcus realized that he had created a monster. Carpenter's interpretation of the temporal fixation process was completely divorced from the love and desperation that had motivated Marcus's original experiments. The young man saw the process as a form of conquest over death itself, a way to achieve immortality through technological manipulation. He had no understanding of the terrible cost that preservation exacted on its subjects. The gradual loss of humanity that Marcus had witnessed in his own family. The final confrontation between Marcus and Carpenter occurred in the basement darkroom on a cold February night in 1966. Marcus had discovered that Carpenter was planning to photograph his own wife without her knowledge or consent, using a modified version of the temporal fixation process that he believed would be more effective than Marcus's methods. Marcus tried to stop him, leading to a violent struggle in which both men were exposed to massive amounts of the toxic processing chemicals. The fight ended when Marcus, in a moment of desperate strength, destroyed the special camera that Crane had created. The brass and crystal device shattered against the concrete floor, its impossible lenses cracking and releasing a brilliant flash of light that temporarily blinded both men. The chemical containers were overturned in the struggle, their contents mixing and creating a toxic cloud that filled the basement. Marcus collapsed from chemical exposure, his already damaged lungs unable to cope with the massive dose of toxins. Carpenter, younger and healthier, survived the immediate effects but was left with severe burns and respiratory damage. In the aftermath of the destruction, both men realized that the temporal fixation process had been permanently disrupted. Without the special camera, and with the chemical formulas contaminated by the mixed processing solutions, there was no way to create new photographs to maintain the family's temporal fixation. Marcus's family, preserved in their eternal state for 14 years, began to show the first signs of temporal instability. The change was subtle at first. The family members continued their daily routines, but their movements became slightly less coordinated. Their conversations began to include odd pauses and repetitions, as if they were struggling to remember their scripted responses. Most disturbing of all, their physical appearance began to flicker occasionally, as if they were having difficulty maintaining their fixed temporal state. Marcus, dying from chemical poisoning, spent his final days watching his family gradually dissolve. The process was not violent or dramatic. They simply became less real with each passing hour. Their voices grew fainter, their physical presence less substantial. They seemed to be fading back into the photographs that had preserved them, their three-dimensional existence slowly collapsing into two-dimensional images. The end came on March 15, 1966. Marcus died in his sleep, and within hours, his family had disappeared entirely. The photographs that had maintained their existence for so many years remained, but they were now simply images on paper, no longer connected to living subjects. The temporal fixation process had finally been broken, and Marcus's family had returned to the timeless state of preserved memory. Carpenter, severely injured and traumatized by the experience, fled the homestead immediately after Marcus's death. He took with him what remained of Crane's journal and the surviving chemical formulas, but he never again attempted to recreate the temporal fixation process. The knowledge that he had gained was too dangerous and too terrible to use, and he spent the rest of his life trying to forget what he had witnessed. The authorities who eventually discovered Marcus's body attributed his death to accidental chemical exposure. The basement darkroom was classified as a hazardous waste site and sealed, with the official report stating that Marcus had been conducting illegal photographic experiments using dangerous chemicals. The family's disappearance was explained as a tragic accident. They had apparently been overcome by the same toxic fumes that had killed Marcus, but the official story could not account for the photographs. The collection of images showing the Hemsworth family remained carefully preserved in their metal containers. The authorities who cataloged these photographs noted their unusual quality and the strange fact that they showed the same subjects across a span of many years without any signs of aging. The images were eventually classified as evidence in a hazardous materials case and stored in a government facility. In the decades that followed, the Hemsworth homestead became the subject of local folklore. Hikers and hunters reported strange lights in the abandoned basement, and some claimed to have seen figures moving through the ruins of the house. The stone marker with the family's names became a destination for curiosity seekers and paranormal investigators, though most visitors departed quickly after experiencing the profound sense of unease that seemed to permeate the site. The cave systems where Marcus had collected the mineral deposits were also changed by the temporal fixation experiments. The organic quality that Marcus had noticed in the cave walls became more pronounced over time. The mineral deposits themselves began to take on increasingly complex forms. Some researchers who studied the caves in later years reported finding crystalline structures that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. And chemical analysis revealed compounds that should not have been able to exist in stable form. The most disturbing discoveries came from photographers who attempted to document the cave systems. Their equipment consistently malfunctioned in specific locations. The images they were able to capture often showed unexplained anomalies. Shadows that fell in impossible directions, reflections that showed scenes from different time periods, and occasionally, the faint outlines of human figures that could not be seen with the naked eye. These photographic anomalies led to speculation on researchers that the temporal fixation process had somehow contaminated the cave systems themselves, creating pockets of temporal instability where the normal flow of time was disrupted.
Awesome.
Theorized that the mineral deposits that Marcus had used for his experiments had been changed by their exposure to the photographic chemicals, creating a kind of temporal feedback loop that continued to operate even after the original process had been broken. The government agencies that investigated these reports found them sufficiently disturbing to classify the entire area as a restricted zone. Official explanations cited unstable geological conditions and hazardous mineral deposits, but the true reason for the restrictions was the growing evidence that the temporal fixation process had created permanent changes in the local environment. David Carpenter, the Forest Service employee who had witnessed the final days of Marcus's experiments, never spoke publicly about his experience. He transferred to a desk job in Washington, D.C., and spent the remainder of his career in administrative positions that kept him far from fieldwork. But in 1988, shortly before his retirement, he was contacted by a researcher who had discovered references to the Hemsworth case in classified government files. The researcher, Dr. Sarah Chen, was a physicist who specialized in temporal anomalies and had been granted security clearance to investigate certain unexplained phenomena. She had discovered that the Hemsworth case was not unique. There were at least 6 other documented instances of similar temporal fixation experiments, all involving photographers who had discovered variations of Crane's process. Dr. Chen's investigation revealed that Aldrich Crane had not developed the temporal fixation process independently. He had been part of a secret government research program during World War II, working with a team of scientists who were exploring the military applications of temporal manipulation. The program had been disbanded after several catastrophic accidents, but individual researchers had continued their work in secret. The mineral deposits that made the temporal fixation process possible were not naturally occurring. They were the result of earlier experiments that had contaminated certain geological formations with temporal energy. The caves that Marcus had used as a source for his photographic chemicals were actually the sites of failed government experiments from the 1940s, where researchers had attempted to create weapons that could trap enemy forces in temporal loops. This revelation casts Marcus's story in a new light. He had not simply stumbled upon a dangerous photographic technique. He had unknowingly become part of a larger pattern of temporal experimentation that had been ongoing for decades. His family's tragic fate was not an isolated incident, but rather one consequence of a secret history of attempts to manipulate time itself. Dr. Chen's research also revealed that the temporal fixation process was not as final as Marcus had believed. The preserved subjects did not simply cease to exist when their photographs were destroyed. They entered a state of temporal suspension that could potentially be reversed under certain conditions. The government had been studying these suspended subjects for years, hoping to find a way to restore them to normal temporal existence. The implications of this research were staggering. If the temporal fixation process could be reversed, it might be possible to rescue Marcus's family from their preserved state. But the same technology that could restore the victims of temporal fixation could also be used to create more powerful versions of the process, potentially allowing for the creation of entire populations of temporally fixed subjects. Interest in temporal fixation was not purely humanitarian. Military applications were obvious. Soldiers who could not age or die would represent the ultimate strategic advantage. But the psychological effects of temporal preservation made such applications problematic. The subjects invariably lost their capacity for growth and change. Becoming increasingly mechanical and predictable over time, Dr. Chen's investigation was abruptly terminated in 1990 when her security clearance was revoked without explanation. The official reason given was budgetary constraints. But Chen suspected that her research had uncovered information that powerful interests wanted to keep hidden. She was transferred to a different department and warned against continuing her temporal anomaly research. But Chen's work had already revealed enough to piece together the larger pattern. The temporal fixation process was not a relic of past experiments. It was an ongoing area of research with implications that extended far beyond the tragedy of the Hemsworth family. The technology existed, the knowledge was preserved, and somewhere in the classified depths of government laboratories, the work continued. The stone marker in the Montana mountains remains, weathered but still legible, marking the site where Marcus Hemsworth made his terrible bargain with time. The photographs that preserved his family's final Christmas morning are stored in a government facility. Their subjects still trapped in eternal suspension, neither alive nor dead. but existing in the liminal space between memory and reality. Local legends speak of voices that can be heard in the mountain wind, calling out the names of family members who have been lost to time. Hikers report finding footprints in the snow that lead to the ruins of the homestead but never leave. Photographers who venture too close to the cave systems sometimes discover that their equipment has captured images of people who are not there. Shadows of subjects who exist only in the preserved moments of their temporal fixation. The most persistent legend concerns the sound of laughter that echoes through the valley on certain nights. The laughter of a 7-year-old girl who has been laughing the same laugh for more than 70 years, her joy preserved and eternal. Repetition, her childhood stolen by a father's desperate love and transformed into an endless loop of captured time. The Hemsworth legacy continues to haunt the remote valleys of Montana, a reminder that some forms of preservation come at a price too terrible to pay. The photographs age and fade, their emulsion cracking and their colors bleeding away, but the piece subjects within them remain forever young, forever trapped, forever calling out across the decades for someone to break the spell that binds them to their captured moments. And in the depths of government facilities, researchers continue their work, studying the temporal fixation process, refining its applications, and searching for ways to harness its power while avoiding its terrible costs. The knowledge that destroyed the Hemsworth family lives on. It's preserved in classified files and secret laboratories, waiting for the next desperate individual who believes that time can be conquered and that love can be made eternal through the cold precision of chemical preservation. The mountains keep their secrets, the caves pulse with their unnatural light, and the photographs wait in their metal containers, holding their subjects in eternal suspension, neither alive nor dead, but existing in the timeless space between what was and what might have been. The Hemsworth family photos have aged, cracked, and faded, but the faces within them remain forever young, forever smiling, forever trapped in the moment when a father's love became a prison and preservation, became a curse that echoes through the decades. In the end, the true horror of the Hemsworth legacy is not the supernatural nature of the temporal fixation process, the very human emotions that drove Marcus to use it. Love, fear, desperation, and the fundamental inability to accept the natural passage of time. These are the forces that transformed a family's happiness into an eternal nightmare. The photographs that were meant to preserve precious memories became instead the instruments of their destruction, proving that some things are too precious to preserve and that the attempt to hold on to perfection can destroy the very thing we seek to protect. The story of the Hemsworth family serves as a warning about the dangers of trying to impose our will upon the natural order of time. Their photographs aged while they remained young, a paradox that reveals the fundamental impossibility of true preservation. In trying to capture eternity, Marcus Hemsworth had created only an elaborate form of death, one that masqueraded as life while slowly consuming the very essence of what it claimed to protect. The classified documents that Dr. Chen uncovered before her investigation was terminated revealed disturbing details about the other temporal fixation cases. In New Mexico, a photographer named William Vasquez had attempted to preserve his elderly parents using a variation of Crane's process. The experiment had succeeded too well. His parents had been locked not only in temporal stasis, but in a state of perpetual dying. They remained conscious and aware, but trapped in the final moments before death, unable to complete their passage into whatever lay beyond. The Vasquez case had required direct government intervention. A specialized team had been dispatched to contain the situation, but their methods remained classified. The official report stated only that the subjects had been neutralized and the site had been sanitized. But witness accounts from neighboring properties described lights in the sky and the sound of machinery that seemed to operate outside. Normal acoustic parameters. In Oregon, a portrait photographer named Margaret Fielding had used the temporal fixation process on her clients without their knowledge, believing that she was giving them the gift of eternal beauty. Her studio had become a gallery of the temporally preserved, each subject frozen in their moment of perfect captured appearance. The discovery of her work had led to a crisis within the government agencies responsible for containing temporal anomalies. The fielding subjects could not be easily disposed of like the Vasquez case. They were ordinary citizens with families and friends who would notice their disappearance. Instead, a complex operation had been mounted to gradually integrate them back into normal society while monitoring their long-term stability. The process had required the creation of false memories, forged documents, and elaborate cover stories to explain their unchanged appearance over the years, but the integration process had not been entirely successful. The fielding subjects retained their temporal fixation, and as decades passed, their unchanged appearance became increasingly difficult to explain. Several had been relocated multiple times, given new identities, and placed in increasingly isolated communities. The psychological effects of their condition had become more pronounced over time, with many displaying symptoms that resembled advanced dementia, though their memories remained technically intact. The most disturbing case in Dr. Chen's files involved a photographer named Robert Kane, who had attempted to create what he called a temporal preserve in rural Vermont. Kane had used the fixation process on an entire small town, preserving all 247 residents in a state of perpetual temporal suspension. The town continued to function normally from the outside, but visitors reported an overwhelming sense of unreality, as if they were walking through a living photograph. The Kane Preserve had been allowed to continue operating under careful government supervision. The residents were unaware of their condition and continued their daily routines with mechanical precision. The town served as a testing ground for studying the long-term effects of mass temporal fixation, but the results had been deeply troubling. The residents were slowly losing their individual identities, becoming more like components of a single collective consciousness. Children in the preserve never aged, but they also never learned or grew intellectually. They repeated the same games, spoke the same words, and displayed the same behaviors day after day. Adults continued working at their jobs, but their productivity had become entirely robotic. They performed their tasks with perfect precision but showed no creativity, no initiative, no capacity for adaptation or improvement. The preserve had become a kind of living museum, preserved in perpetual stasis, but slowly dying from the inside. The government researchers who studied it had concluded that temporal fixation was not sustainable over long periods. The subjects invariably degraded, losing their humanity bit by bit until they became little more than sophisticated automatons. These discoveries had led to the development of what the classified documents referred to as the Temporal Restoration Protocol. The government had been working on methods to reverse the temporal fixation process, but the technology remained experimental and extremely dangerous. Early attempts at restoration had resulted in what the documents described as temporal cascade failures, where subjects would rapidly age through all the years they had missed, often dying within minutes of the restoration process. The protocol had been refined over the years, but it remained largely theoretical. The government's interest in temporal fixation had shifted from preservation to weaponization. Military applications were being explored, including the possibility of creating temporal displacement weapons that could trap enemy forces in temporal loops or accelerate their aging processes. The research had also revealed that the mineral deposits used in the temporal fixation process were not limited to the cave systems that Marcus had discovered. Similar formations existed in locations around the world, often associated with sites of historical trauma or significance. The deposits seemed to be created by intense emotional energy combined with specific geological conditions, suggesting that the capacity for temporal manipulation was more widespread than previously believed. Dr. Chin's investigation had been terminated when she discovered evidence that some of these mineral deposits were being artificially created. The government was apparently working on methods to produce the temporal fixation minerals in laboratory conditions, which would allow for the large-scale production of temporal preservation technology. The implications of this discovery were staggering. If the government could mass-produce temporal fixation technology, it would fundamentally alter the nature of human existence. Death could become optional, aging could be prevented, and the flow of time itself could be manipulated for political and military purposes, but the Hemsworth case demonstrated the terrible cost of such technology. Marcus's family had been preserved in their moment of happiness, but they had lost their capacity for growth, change, and genuine life. They had become beautiful corpses, animated by photographic emulsion and sustained by chemical processes that gradually consumed their humanity. The government's interest in temporal fixation was not motivated by humanitarian concerns. Classified documents made clear that the technology was being developed as a tool of control and conquest. Populations could be preserved in states of political compliance. Soldiers could be made effectively immortal, and dissidents could be trapped in temporal loops that would prevent them from organizing or acting against the government. The Hemsworth photographs, stored in their government facility, served as both evidence of the technology's possibilities and a warning about its dangers. The family's faces, still young and smiling after more than 70 years, represented the ultimate expression of human desire to preserve what we love. But their eternal imprisonment in captured moments demonstrated the impossibility of holding on to life through artificial means. The researchers who studied the photographs reported disturbing phenomena associated with their storage. The facility where they were kept experienced regular equipment failures, with computers crashing and displaying images that had not been saved to their memory systems. Security cameras occasionally recorded figures moving through areas where no one should have been present, and the images showed people who matched the appearance of the Hemsworth family members. Staff members who worked with the photographs reported experiencing temporal disorientation, finding themselves losing track of time while examining the images. Some described feeling as if they were being watched by the subjects in the photographs, and several requested transfers to different departments after experiencing what they described as temporal intrusions. Brief moments when they felt as if they were living in the time period depicted in the images. The most disturbing incidents involved researchers who spent extended periods studying the photographs began to display symptoms similar to those observed in the fielding subjects. Their behavior became increasingly repetitive and mechanical. Their speech patterns grew more rigid, and they seemed to lose their capacity for spontaneous thought or action. Several researchers had to be removed from the project after showing signs of temporal fixation themselves, despite never having been directly photographed using Crane's process. These incidents led to the implementation of strict protocols for handling the Hemsworth photographs. Researchers were limited to brief exposure periods and were required to undergo regular psychological evaluations. The photographs themselves were stored in specially designed containers that were supposed to prevent their temporal effects from influencing the surrounding environment. But the containment measures were not entirely effective. The facility continued to experience anomalous phenomena, and the photographs seemed to be exerting an influence that extended beyond their physical boundaries. Reports from nearby communities described unexplained incidents, families finding old photographs in their homes that showed people they didn't recognize, but who looked exactly like the subjects in the Hemsworth images. Children in the area began having recurring dreams about a family that lived in the mountains. Some started drawing pictures of people who matched the appearance of Marcus's family. Most disturbing of all, several children reported having conversations with imaginary friends who claimed to be from the 1950s and who knew details about that time period that the children should not have possessed. The government's response to these incidents was to expand the restricted zone around the original Hemsworth homestead and to increase security at the facility where the photographs were stored. But the temporal effects seemed to be spreading despite these measures, suggesting that the fixation process had created a kind of temporal contamination that could not be easily contained. The classified documents that Dr. Chen had accessed before her investigation was terminated contained references to a phenomenon called temporal bleed-through, where the effects of fixation could spread to affect people in places that had never been directly involved in the original process. The theory was that temporal fixation created weak points in the fabric of time itself, allowing preserved moments to leak into the normal flow of temporal existence. The Hemsworth case had become the primary example of temporal bleed-through, with the family's preserved moments apparently influencing the surrounding area in ways that defied scientific explanation. The photographs seemed to be acting as focal points for temporal energy, drawing power from the emotional resonance of the family's story and using it to maintain their subject's existence in a state of suspended animation. But the preservation was not perfect. The photographs showed signs of degradation over time. The subjects within them seemed to be slowly losing their definition and clarity. The government researchers who studied them reported that the images were becoming increasingly unstable, with the figures occasionally flickering or displaying distortions that suggested their temporal fixation was beginning to break down. The degradation process was accelerating. The researchers estimated that the photographs would lose their ability to maintain their subject's preservation within the next decade. When that happened, the Hemsworth family would finally be released from their temporal prison, but the process would likely be violent and traumatic. The accumulated temporal energy would be released all at once, potentially creating a cascade effect that could affect the entire region. The government was preparing for this eventuality with a project called Temporal Stabilization Initiative, which aimed to either strengthen the photograph's preservation effects or to safely disperse the temporal energy before it could cause widespread damage. But the technology required for either approach remained experimental, and the risks of intervention were considered, almost as dangerous as the risks of allowing the natural degradation process to continue. The researchers working on the project faced a terrible dilemma. They could attempt to strengthen the temporal fixation, which would condemn the Hemsworth family to eternal imprisonment, but might prevent catastrophic temporal disruption. Or they could work to break the fixation entirely, which would finally free the family, but might trigger a temporal cascade that could affect thousands of people. The decision was complicated by the fact that the Hemsworth family, despite their preserved state, were still technically alive. They existed in a liminal space between life and death, consciousness and unconsciousness, reality and memory. Any intervention would effectively determine their fate, either condemning them to eternal preservation or forcing them to confront the 70 years of existence they had missed. The ethical implications of this decision were staggering. The government have the right to make such a choice for people who could not consent. Were the Hemsworth family members still human enough to deserve the right to live and die naturally? Or had their temporal fixation transformed them into something else entirely, entities that existed outside the normal boundaries of human existence? The classified documents revealed that similar decisions had been made in other temporal fixation cases, usually favoring containment over liberation. The government's position was that the risks of temporal cascade were too great to justify freeing the preserved subjects, even if their continued imprisonment was ethically questionable. But the Hemsworth case was different because of the public interest it had generated. The story of the family that never aged had become part of local folklore, and too many people knew about the photographs and their unusual properties. If the government attempted to maintain the fixation artificially, or if they allowed a temporal cascade to occur, the cover-up would be extremely difficult to maintain. The solution being considered was what the documents referred to as controlled temporal dissolution. The plan was to gradually weaken the photograph's preservation effects over a period of several years, allowing the Hemsworth family to age slowly through the decades they had missed. The process would be monitored carefully to prevent temporal cascade, and the family would be gradually reintegrated into normal temporal existence. But the controlled dissolution process was entirely theoretical. It had never been attempted on such a large scale, and the risks were largely unknown. The Hemsworth family might not survive the process, or they might emerge from their preservation in a state of severe temporal shock that would make normal existence impossible. The government was also concerned about the political implications of revealing the existence of temporal fixation technology. If the public learned that such technology existed, it would raise uncomfortable questions about other secret research programs and the extent of government experimentation on human subjects. The classified documents suggested that the Hemsworth case was just one example of a much larger pattern of temporal experimentation that had been ongoing for decades. The government had been studying time manipulation technology since the 1940s, and there were apparently other cases of temporal fixation that had been successfully concealed from public knowledge. The scope of this hidden history was staggering. The documents referenced research facilities in multiple states, Hundreds of subjects who had been preserved in various forms of temporal stasis and military applications that had been tested. In classified operations around the world, the temporal fixation technology represented just one aspect of a broader program of chronological manipulation that included time dilation, temporal acceleration, and even limited forms of time travel. The Hemsworth photographs yellowing and cracking in their government storage facility were not just evidence of one man's desperate attempt to preserve his family. They were artifacts of a secret history of temporal experimentation that had been hidden from the American people for generations. The smiling faces of Marcus, Alina, Thomas, Sarah, and little Catherine represented not just the victims of a single tragic experiment, but the human cost of a research program that had treated time itself as a weapon to be conquered and controlled. The true horror of the Hemsworth legacy was not the supernatural nature of their preservation, but the institutional machinery that had allowed such experiments to continue for so long. The government researchers who studied their photographs were not motivated by scientific curiosity or humanitarian concern, but by the desire to weaponize temporal manipulation for political and military purposes. The family's story had become a footnote in a much larger and more disturbing narrative of secret experimentation on human subjects. Their photographs served as a reminder that behind every classified research program there were real people, whose lives had been destroyed by the pursuit of technological power over the natural order of existence. As the years passed and the photographs continued to degrade, the Hemsworth family remained trapped in their eternal Christmas morning, their laughter echoing through the decades, their love preserved in chemical emulsion and government secrecy. They had become symbols of the terrible cost of trying to impose human will upon the fundamental forces of time and mortality. The stone marker in the Montana mountains continued to weather and crack, but the names carved into its surface remained legible, testament to a family that had been frozen in time by love and destroyed by the very preservation that was meant to protect them. The inscription read, "Forever young in memory." But the truth was far more complex and terrible than those simple words could convey. The Hemsworth legacy lived on in the classified files and secret laboratories where researchers continued their work on temporal manipulation, always searching for ways to harness the power of time while avoiding the terrible costs that had destroyed Marcus's family. The knowledge that had created their tragedy remained alive in the minds of scientists and military officials who saw temporal fixation not as a warning, but as a tool waiting to be perfected. And in the depths of the government facility where the photographs were stored, the Hemsworth family continued their eternal existence. Neither alive nor dead, but preserved in the liminal space between memory and reality, waiting for someone to make the decision that would determine whether they would finally be freed from their temporal prison or condemned to eternal preservation in the service of a government that had long since forgotten the human cost of its secret experiments with time itself.